I invite you to take your Bibles this morning and turn over with me to John chapter 2. John chapter 2, we're going to be reading and studying about the first miracle that Jesus performed in his ministry here upon this earth. And just to kind of bring us back up to speed, I know it's been, 3 weeks, I guess, since we've looked at this particular series. But if you were with us the last Sunday evening that we studied this series, this going through the Bible, particularly now we're looking at the life of Jesus, you know that there were 6 disciples who had begun following Jesus. Remember, John had pointed out who Jesus was, and now he has these 6 men who are following him around, and they're starting to learn and get a glimpse of exactly who Jesus is. And I think personally, whenever I read through these stories in the New Testament, many of these I've read so many times I can almost quote them about the things that have happened. And sometimes when you can do that, they kind of, they kind of lose the impact, I think, that they're supposed to have on us when you've heard a story or read it over and over and over again. But I want to emphasize as we're looking at these, that these were, every day in the life of these men that they spent with Jesus was a new day. And every event that they experienced was a new event. And they're starting through these days and through these events to come to a better understanding of exactly who Jesus is. And John, the Gospel of John is kind of a unique letter in that it differs from the other accounts of the Gospel because it has a different design and a different purpose. You remember John writes at the end of this letter in John chapter 20 and verse 31, he said, "These things are written that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name." And so what we know about the letter that John wrote here in this book is that by inspiration, God inspired him to pick out certain events within the life of Jesus that clearly identified him as the Son of God and create belief. And if you understand, you compare those different Gospels, well, they're not different Gospels, but they're different accounts of the same Gospel. If you compare those, you know that John has some unique material. John has some events that he records that some of these other writers don't even mention. But he has a specific purpose in mind. And again, that purpose is to bring out the identity of Jesus Christ, to clearly identify him to us as the Son of God and create belief in him. So John, whenever it starts with the miracles of Jesus, he doesn't start where all these other people start. John starts with the very first miracle that Jesus performed. And if you're familiar with that miracle, you know that it took place at a wedding. And, weddings are kind of unique events too. They should be very cheerful events. I think most people who attend weddings are happy about them. But there's also a little bit of seriousness. There's a lot of seriousness, but tension involved with a wedding. Sometimes as a preacher, when people come to me and say, will you perform my wedding ceremony? I almost said, will you marry me? I have to clarify that a little bit in our society. But will you perform my wedding ceremony? I say sure, and I smile. But deep inside, I'm a little bit nervous because, a wedding is a very special thing. And the last thing that you want to do when you're kind of conducting and overseeing this particular ceremony is you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to mess up this very important event and the important things that are happening there. And so there's always a fair amount of tension that is involved in a wedding. I always breathe a sigh of relief, when everything goes smoothly and it happens like it should. But when you think about this wedding, this particular wedding that we're reading about took place about 2,000 years ago. It was in a small village in the region of Galilee. And it was a wedding a lot like our weddings today. Now, obviously, the customs of that day and age were different than our customs that we have today. But it was a joyful event, just like it would be a joyful event in our society. And there were also, I imagine, some anxiety, involved in some of the big expectations and the plans that people had for this particular wedding. Now, there was one thing that was very special about this wedding that stands out from all other weddings that have been conducted here upon this earth. And that is the presence of the Son of God, of Jesus. Notice in John chapter 2 and beginning in verse 1. It says, "And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage." So Jesus got an invitation to go to this marriage. And what I'd kind of like to think a little bit deeper as we go through this story today. Why was Jesus invited to this wedding? Now, obviously, right now, he's performed no miracles. You know, it wasn't because of these great feats that he was doing. John has just newly identified him as the Messiah and the Son of God. So you could say, well, maybe some people were curious. But I think more than likely, it's some kind of relative or it's some kind of friend close to Jesus, or maybe even just his mother. You know, the fact that it's mentioned that his mother is present at this particular wedding, it seems like there's some kind of connection between her and the bride or the bridegroom. And so think about that idea as we go through this. And we want to look at it from maybe a little bit different perspective than normal. But we want to think about some of the lessons that we can learn as we read through this particular miracle and we study it. And one of the first things and the point that I want to emphasize as we go through this story, one of the first things that stands out to me is the statement that Mary, his mother, makes about Jesus. Notice in verse 3. It says, "And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, They have no wine. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it." You know, Mary announces the problem that arises within this marriage celebration, this marriage feast. And immediately she turns her attention to Jesus. Now, again, I want to emphasize, why did Mary know this particular thing? Well, I think she either had to be very close to the bride or the bridegroom. You know, this wasn't something that you just walk out and tell a total stranger. Or even she was very closely connected maybe to the overseeing of the things that were taking place. But she clearly has a personal concern for what's happening within this wedding. So either she's concerned because of the parties that she's involved with, because of the relationships she's had, or maybe she's in part, has some part in this service or overseeing the festivities of that particular day and age. And so the problem is this: they didn't have anything else to drink. Now, I've talked before about, you know, the idea of the Jew in that day and age. They didn't have faucets like we have today. You know, they didn't have bottled water sitting in every corner. Their main drink was the product of grape juice. And so that was something, because vineyards were very plentiful and grapes were very plentiful in that day and age, that's what everybody drank, and that's about what every house had. And so here they were in the middle of this celebration, and now they don't have anything to drink. Well, they can't just run down to the local 7-Eleven, you know, or the corner drugstore and grab something and come back home. They were in a very serious predicament. And so what does Mary do? Well, she knows that there's nothing that she can do or anybody else, right? But she knows that there is somebody there who could do something. And that was Jesus, her son. And so she tells them they have no wine. And there's an exchange that takes place between Jesus and Mary, and that exchange is very interesting to me. It tells us a lot about both of them as individuals. But I think Jesus understood what she was asking him to do, didn't he? Because he basically tells her, he says, what concern is that to me? You know, this isn't my job. When you think about miracles, Jesus didn't come to this earth to just throw miracles around, did he? You know, he didn't come over here to throw a little miracle here and then one over here and one over here. There was a design and there was a purpose in everything that he did and in every miracle that he performed. And so basically he's telling her, this is not my timetable. You know, this is not my lot that I have been put into this life to do. And so he basically tells her in the latter part of verse 4, he says, mine hour is not yet come. What's he talking about there? Well, his hour to display his miraculous power. It hasn't come to the point in his life and his ministry where God says, okay, now it's time to go out and perform these miracles. And so he understands what she's asking of him, but in the same breath, he also points out, my purpose here upon earth isn't just to walk over here and throw miracles around right and left. And so they have a pretty interesting exchange. Now, Mary reacts in verse 5. This is typical mother reaction, right? It's like Jesus didn't say anything. Your mom ever react to you like that? Where she asks you to do something, you kind of go through this huge explanation. She just pretends like you didn't say anything, just goes on. That's kind of what Mary does here. But she points out, she just says this in verse 5. She turns to the servants and she says, whatever he tells you to do, do it. Okay, remember Jesus has just said, this isn't my lot. I don't have any part in this. My time, my hour has not yet come. And it's just like she lays it all on Christ. She turns to these servants and says, listen to him and do whatever he tells you to do. Now, there are a couple of things that I do want to point out about Mary, though. She does not fight with Jesus. She doesn't quarrel with him. She doesn't even tell him what to do, does she? But what she does do is she leaves the matter wholly in his hands. She knew that there was nothing she could do. She knew that there was nothing that anybody else at that wedding could do. The only person that could do anything was Christ. And she basically just walks away and leaves it in his hands and tells all the people there, trust him. Whatever he tells you to do, go ahead and do it. That's such a great principle in life. If we could just live by that principle, a lot of our cares and troubles and strifes in this world would be taken care of. How many times do we come to God with a problem? We're not like Mary. We try to tell God what he needs to do, right? Well, here's the problem. Here's what I want to see happen. Mary didn't do any of that. She just said, here's the problem. I trust you. I'm going to turn it over into your hands. You'll take care of it. I know you will. And whatever you tell us to do, we're going to totally trust you and we're going to carry that out. Well, a great principle, I think, to put into practice in our lives. I want us also to think about the dilemma that was being faced if Jesus was not present at that particular wedding. We read about it in verse 3. It says, when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, they have no wine. And I'm not going to go into, or I'm going to try not to go into a big explanation of wine and the meaning of it and all those things. When I put this lesson together, I actually thought on Sunday evening tonight that I would do an entire lesson on did Jesus turn water into intoxicating wine. And I had an opportunity a few weeks ago to preach a particular gospel sermon, and the theme of gospel lessons meeting, and the theme of that meeting was life after baptism. And one of the things that we studied, one of the lessons that came into my mind was the lesson that we looked at in that particular study, maturity, or on to perfection. And basically it deals with this idea how, as Christians, one of the marks of spiritual immaturity is we can't get over the little things in the Bible. These basic, these elementary, these principal things. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, that's not what this story is all about. That's not the great lesson that we need to take away from it. But I do want to point out the word wine, as it was translated into English in 1611, and also the Greek word, is a very versatile word. And it just simply means the product of a grape. That's exactly what it means. Now, sometimes you read about it in the Bible, the context indicates it was an intoxicating drink. Sometimes it was not. As Bible students, we have to do our due diligence and study the context of those mentions of this product of the grape. And then in our minds, we have to determine, in accordance with Bible teaching, how we should interpret such a word. That's one of these events that you'll read about in the Bible. Now, I say all that to point out, listen, if you think that Jesus gave people intoxicating wine, if you think that Christ contributed to drunkenness, then we might as well go out and open our own party pantry, right, Danny? Because that would be okay. If Jesus did it, we could do it too. We could sell all kinds of drugs. We could sell anything. If Jesus contributed to the intoxicated nature of these people, if that's what this story is all about, he didn't sin. So it's not a sin for us to do it too. I would encourage you, think about everything the Bible teaches. Think about the words of wisdom when it involves strong drink and liquor. Think about the commandments within God's Word. Think about the examples. And don't try to mold a story into what we want it to be to try to justify something that we or maybe one of our friends or our loved ones want to do in this life. I think people have done that with this particular miracle. So I said all that to say this, get off my soapbox here. I don't want to minimize the great story here by spending all of our time dealing with that particular subject. So I kind of chosen not to pursue it fully in that way. So what happens here? The problem is stated by Mary. Well, you have to understand a couple things about this. The wedding feast was not like a wedding feast today. You know, generally when people have a wedding today, sometimes they have a meal, sometimes they don't. But those who have ever been involved in that, you know the dilemma behind the meal, right? You got to decide, well, how many people are going to be here and how much food do we need? And we don't want to run out. Well, the wedding feast, the celebration of this day and age, lasted about 7 days. Can you imagine that? Trying to plan for the number of people and trying to make sure that you had adequate provisions for everybody who's going to be here. So during this 7-day period, what happens? They didn't plan accordingly. And so they've run out of anything to drink. They don't have anything for anybody to drink. And so they have this dilemma upon their hands. Now understand, would it have been embarrassing? This was primarily the responsibility of the groom in these situations. Would it have been embarrassing? Absolutely, it would have, wouldn't it? I even read some particular commentaries that stated you could actually be fined. By law, you could have been fined if you didn't provide enough food for your wedding feast. And so it could have been embarrassing for him. It could have been a costly venture. But the point that I want to draw is, if Jesus had not been there, think about the dilemma they would have been in. Think about how terrible this story could have turned out. How much different it could have been. You know, again, there wasn't like this local store where they could just run down and grab something to drink and bring it back to the house and provide it for the guests. But not only that, we learned from the story, you know, there's 6 huge water pots that are being provided for the guests, and these water pots range anywhere in or go anywhere in the range from 20 to 30 gallons apiece. So you're talking about 120 to 180 gallons to provide for this, however much of this feast was left. Where are you going to come up with that kind of grape juice? Well, you weren't in that day and age. It wasn't going to happen without a miracle. And so Jesus comes to the rescue. You know, it's a great lesson for us in life too, because think about some of the problems. If we had to face those problems in life, if Jesus weren't with us, how difficult that would be. There would be no hope. You know, the Bible talks about, or Paul wrote about Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12, about the Gentile world. He said that at that time ye were without Christ. And I want to emphasize that. They were without Christ. Later on, he talks about they were without God in the world. And you know what a person's situation is if they're without Christ and without God? Paul said there, you are without hope. There is no hope for you to make it through difficult situations in life without God and without Christ. This is a perfect illustration of that example. Where would they have been without Jesus being there? Well, it was only because Jesus was there that something was able to be done. It was only because Jesus was there that hope was provided. And so the same is true in our lives today. You know, if we have Jesus in our lives, we have the hope of something greater and better. There's always the hope that something can be done. And it would be a pretty difficult situation in life that we would face without Christ being by our side. Let's talk about or look at, though, the difference that Jesus makes. Notice in verse 6, begin. It says, and there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Jesus saith unto them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast, and they bare it. And when the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. You know, think about what kind of difference did Jesus make at this wedding? Well, a tremendous difference. And again, the application for us is, what kind of difference does Jesus make in our lives? What happened because Jesus was there? There was a transformation that took place. Water was transformed into wine. And you know, when you think about Jesus' presence in our life, there should be a transformation that takes place in our life too, because Christ lives within us. Jesus called it in John chapter 3 and verse 3 when he talked to Nicodemus. He called it the new birth. Have you ever thought about Christianity from that perspective? You're born again. What does that mean? It means you become a new person, right? A new individual, a new life. When you think about Romans chapter 6 and verse 4, Paul talks about the idea of Jesus being resurrected from the dead. And then he says that just like Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. What happened when Jesus was resurrected from the dead? There was a transformation that took place. He didn't arise from the dead to go back and live upon earth again and redo all those same things that he'd done previously. He arose to a new life, a new being, a new person, a new existence, a spiritual existence in heaven. And Paul draws that parallel between the resurrection of Christ and when we become Christians. We don't become a Christian. When we come up out of the watery grave of baptism, when we're resurrected from the dead, we aren't resurrected to be the same person we were before. We're not resurrected to live the same life that we lived back then. There's a transformation that should take place in our life. We arise to walk in newness of life, a new person, a new being. You know, I like what Jesus said to Peter in John chapter 1 and verse 42. Remember when he meets Peter, he says, "Thou art Simon, the son of Joseph, Jonas." I'll get it right here in a minute. Simon, the son of Jonas. But he said, "Thou shalt be called Cephas," or Peter. There's a lot that's written about that particular verse. What did Jesus mean by that statement? And I always tell you, since I'm the one up here, you have to listen to my opinion. So I think what Jesus was talking about, well, I know what he was talking about, was there was going to be a transformation in the life of Peter. Because he had met Christ, because he had come into contact with him, he had opened his life and his heart to Jesus, there was a transformation that was going to take place. He was going to be transformed into a strong, a solid, and immovable, unbreakable rock for God. And Jesus, when he met Peter, he saw that potential within him, and he desired to transform him. Friends, it's the same thing that Jesus desires for us. The difference that Jesus makes in our life. There was a transformation that took place at this particular wedding because of the presence of Christ. And there should be a transformation that takes place within our lives today. If you look at verse 10, another interesting thing is notice the quality that Jesus gave. Whenever the wine, the product of the grape is brought before the governor, the guy who was kind of in charge of this entire feast, and he tasted of it. Do you remember what he said? He said, "You guys save the good stuff till last." You know, usually how it's done in a wedding is you bring out the good stuff first, and then as people go through, you kind of, you get worse and worse and worse till you get to the bottom of the barrel. But you guys have saved the best for last. He was surprised, wasn't he? He was surprised that the quality had gone up and not that it had gone down. But if you think about the quality of the Christian life, that's a great way to describe it too, isn't it? I think the quality of the Christian life, it just keeps getting better and better as we get older. The gifts of the spiritual gifts that God gives us get sweeter every day. The passing of time makes those things so much more precious to us. And when this life is over and when we pass into the heavens, we're going to find out how much better a life God has prepared for us than this life here upon this earth. The bottom line is the best is yet to come. The best comes at the end, not at the beginning, the quality. And so Jesus makes a tremendous difference in our lives. The last thing that I want for us to think about is the mention of the display of Jesus' glory. Notice in verse 11, John says, "This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him." Now keep in mind, this is the first miraculous event of Jesus while he was living here upon this earth that he performed. And when you think about the miracles of Jesus, usually there was a lot of commotion, that was involved in it. But this spectacular event it wasn't like a lot of the other miracles that he performed. It wasn't witnessed by everyone. In fact, in verse 9, a lot of people at this feast didn't even have any idea what had gone on. The Bible tells us the governor didn't have a clue, what had happened, but the servants did, didn't they? And Jesus' disciples did, and his mother did also. But nobody else at that wedding even had a clue that miracle had taken place. Now, think about that and contrast that with some of Jesus' last miracles here upon the earth, like the raising of Lazarus from the dead. That was something that everybody knew about and everybody talked about, but this was, just something that was really under the radar, kind of behind the scenes. Why did Jesus do it? There's more to this miracle than just meeting a human need. It's not just about saving a person or a family from social embarrassment. That's not the purpose of miracles. He did it because it did something for those people who witnessed. It did something for his mother. It did something for these 6 new disciples who had begun following him. It did something for these servants. And what the Bible tells us it did is it revealed to them his glory. It showed them who he really was. It gave them a firm foundation to plant their faith upon, to believe in Jesus as the Son of God indeed. John uses an interesting word there to describe what Jesus did in verse 11. It's translated into our English language as the word miracles. And there are different ways, different words that are used to describe these miraculous feats that Jesus did. Signs, powers, wonders, miracles, all those things refer to some of these great events. But John didn't use a word that emphasized the power of Jesus. He used a word, a lot of versions translate it as a sign. And that's what the literal meaning is. You ever think about a sign? What's the purpose of a sign? Well, a sign is an indicator. It's something that points beyond itself. In other words, it's not really the focus of our attention, but it's focusing our attention on something else. It's indicating something greater that is to come. And so these people witnessed the miracles of Jesus. Did they believe a miracle had taken place? Well, yeah. I mean, even some of the enemies of Christ believed a miracle had taken place, didn't they? They couldn't deny some of the things that Jesus did. But it wasn't just so they would believe that Jesus did a miracle. It was so they would believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That was the purpose. That was what these signs were pointing to. That's what they were indicating to the people. It's often interesting to me, after Jesus performed one of these signs, that he often added a sermon to it. That wasn't the main point that Jesus wanted people to remember about this. And so like in John chapter 5, you have the healing of the paralyzed man, and then Jesus uses that. It's a sign to point that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He preaches a sermon about that. In John chapter 6, you read about him feeding 5,000 people, and he uses that. It's a sign that he preaches a sermon off of as Jesus, the bread of life. I often wonder, if Jesus preached a sermon after this miracle, what would that sermon be? Well, bottom line is I don't know. But I'd like to think maybe it would be some of these things that we talked about. Maybe it would be this idea that we ought to do whatever Jesus tells us to do. That we ought to totally trust him. That we ought to come to him with our problems and lay them down and not tell him what to do. Just report the problem to him and have faith in him that he'll take care of the rest. Maybe it would be a sermon about the dilemma that we're in if Jesus is not present in our lives. Maybe it would have been a sermon about the difference that Jesus can make in our lives, how he can transform us and our lives to be what we ought to be what God wants us to be, and how our quality of life can continue to improve as time goes on, leaving the very best for last. I don't know what he would have preached because he didn't preach after this particular miracle. But these are valuable lessons that we can glean from the very first miracle that Jesus performed while he was here upon this earth. Maybe there's one present in the audience this morning who has never obeyed the gospel of Christ. The opportunity is laid before you at this time to do that. Maybe you're an erring child of God.